Hello, welcome to Postcolonial Space. I'm Masood Raja, and what follows is an excerpted clip from one of my longer webinars. So what I've decided is that sometimes when people ask really interesting questions, I will pull out that particular part of a webinar and make it available to you as a short clip so that if you don't have time to watch a 1-hour webinar, you can at least watch and listen to the brief exchanges that I usually have with people who attend my webinars. So here is one such clip from a recent webinar. I hope you enjoy it. Today we'll briefly be talking about what I had given you to watch, mostly a clear understanding of postcolonialism and then moving into some background materials about Heart of Darkness. So let me start slightly even from before postcolonialism, and that is that like any other field of study, English departments are also organized in different periods, sub-periods, and sub-specializations. There are two major branches in literary studies. One is what we call British literature, the other is what we call American literature. Now, in British literature, then people specialize in different periods. So you'll usually encounter a professor who is a Shakespeare scholar, a medievalist, someone who specializes in Victorian literature, Romantic literature, British modern literature. These are all different periods. Similarly, if you go to the Americanists, you'll see people who specialize in early American realism, American modernism, and then within that there'll be professors who specialize in American ethnic literature, African American literature, Latinx literature. So these are subfields of English, two major fields. Now, postcolonialism doesn't really belong to either one of them because officially it's considered an established subfield of study. But it's a subfield of English studies where people study the impact of 19th and 20th century colonialism on the world, which was formerly colonized. You can also call it tricontinentalism because most of these people deal with Africa, they deal with Asia, Caribbean, and South America, of course. And so issues are related to what were the consequences of colonialism, how did the native people respond to it, what atrocities were committed by colonizers, okay, how did the native people of India or Kenya or elsewhere develop their own politics, how did they develop their independence movements, how did they either negotiated for their freedom or literally ousted their colonizers. All of these things are covered in postcolonial studies. Now, as I mentioned in my video, of course, the post in postcolonialism doesn't mean that colonialism is over, right? The world is still lopsided. If you look at the global resources, the power of the corporations and the nations, according to some researchers, 64% of the world's profits, wherever they are made, they travel back to the North Atlantic region, to America, Canada, UK, France. So the Europeans and Americas still have a definite advantage in the world trade. And colonialism has kind of reconfigured itself, right? Now it doesn't go and capture territories. It just, buys leaderships, goes and captures captive labor, right? Cheap labor and all that people talk about under investment and so many. So these struggles still continue. The idea is to understand, how the people from the former colonies or people from the developing world, how do they see this power dynamics? How do they see America, right? And that's what postcolonial studies also enables. Heart of Darkness is a big novel, not a big novel, I mean, it's a novella, but it's an important novel. And the reason I'm teaching it is because, first of all, it's subject matter, right? And the time period in which it was published, right? It was published in 1899. Now that's kind of height of colonialism. Most of Africa is already colonized and divided amongst European powers. Then Britain is at the height of its own colonial period, right? Britain is the largest empire at that time. So because of that, Heart of Darkness is important because it's a novel that deals with the specific area, which is Congo, and its colonization, not by Belgium as a nation, but by the king of Belgium, King Leopold II. Leopold II actually convinces the Berlin Conference people that he wants this as a philanthropic mission, that he wants to make people's lives better, and that's how he gets that territory as his own private territory, a huge territory in the center of Africa. And then what he unleashes there is a ruthless system of extraction. Okay, Congo was rich in tin, rich in ivory, and a lot of other things. And all Leopold II does is establishes different trading posts, has his officials there. The natives are completely treated like slaves, and they are used as free labor to extract ivory, to extract tin, and export it to Europe. Now, when I say extract ivory, part of it is because a lot of ivory that was recovered was fossilized ivory. These were elephants who had previously died and left their tusks there, right? And then elephants were also massively hunted, and the ivory was exported to Europe. Now, what I'm also trying to teach you is that when you read a text, right, any text, literary or political, in order to understand the text, you have to also gather materials from outside of it, historically, right? Then aesthetically, maybe something about the author, something about the author's politics, and then you have to account for your own politics as well. So when you read, an act of reading involves the text that you're reading. It involves you. Where are you coming from? Because that encourages you to look at a text a certain way. And then somewhat, where was the author coming from? So that's why we're doing these background materials. Before Conrad writes Heart of Darkness, he had written 3, I think, major novels, and those are called the Malay trilogy. His first novel was Almayer's Folly. Now, those 3 novels were set in Dutch Malaya, okay, which is now called Malaysia, right? And it was a Dutch colony. So, and they dealt with the issues of the Dutch and the natives, right? And what were the conflicts, but mostly that's where. Now, remember, Conrad was a sailor, right? Now, the way it relates to Conrad's previous work is, first of all, that it still is the story told by a sailor, right? But Conrad consciously decides that he was going to write a novel about Africa. And then he decides to take a job. He actually traveled up the same river about which he wrote this novel, about the Congo River. He actually captained a steamboat, took a job, went there, and kept copious notes. So nothing that he writes in Heart of Darkness was accidental. It was part of his plan to write a novel on Africa. And he goes there, works there, does his research, writes quite a few notes, and then comes back and writes the novel. So in a way, it is a novel related to his previous work, but it's also kind of a bridge to his later works that become more and more modernist after that. How large was the book? Well, that's the point. it had quite an impact, the book. And we'll go into it as we start discussing the book, because remember, the book comes before the Roger Casement report comes and is discussed in the Parliament. And I'll post the link to the Casement report as well. Now, the book, because of its sentimental representation of what was being done to the people of Congo, it had a huge impact. People read it. People were horrified at what King Leopold II was doing. And eventually, after the Casement report comes out, Roger Casement was a humanist who also did his research in Congo and wrote a report for the British Parliament, right? And so eventually the book had a public impact, but the Casement report was discussed in the British Parliament and then was sent to King Leopold II's, not himself, but his parliament, and they were the ones who finally revoked his charter. So the book had a huge impact in creating a public sentiment against the kind of colonization practices in Congo. Does Conrad's other works have racist tones as well? Well, yes, pretty much they do, but I personally wrote an essay a few years ago where I was saying, well, let's not call him a thoroughgoing racist, right? Because there is more nuance to his work, right? And I had read his Malay fiction, right, where he uses racist vocabularies for the natives. But in that trilogy, eventually the natives win, right? And they win against a powerful Dutch, colonial power. And Conrad also gives the natives this agency, right, to think that, okay, we are up against this power, we can't fight it head on. And so it's not just conniving natives, plotting against the Europeans. It's more subtle than that. So yeah, if you just read the obvious vocabularies, of course, there are racist vocabularies in the novel. But there are also, of course, more nuanced ways of reading Conrad. The entire style of writing is Conrad's, right? But the first narrator that introduced the story and introduces us to Marlowe, has a different tone in a way, and gives us the broader picture of where the ship is and how the story starts, and then gives us the ending, right? And then Marlowe, also written by Conrad, you see the shift, how Marlowe speaks. He's more ironic. Marlowe is in a way funny, and he's critical, deeply critical, and sometimes cynical about the world that he's acknowledging. So I think that kind of makes the two narrators as different people. The omniscient narrator who introduces us to Marlowe and other characters on the deck of the boat, and then Marlowe takes on the story, right? Does evidence suggest Conrad allied more with the established European concept of superiority or with the subjected thought of free rule? Well, that's also complicated. I mean, Conrad is a product of his own time. He's a European writer, but he also dealt with his own anxieties, right? He's Polish, who becomes a British citizen and then is writing in English. So he dealt with that kind of racism himself. I think that in the novel, as you will see, he is trying to play it very safe. And how is he planning to play? What he's saying is that there is a better kind of colonialism, more organized, more efficient, that the British do. And this, what is happening in Congo, is the worst kind of colonialism because it's ruthless, because it's totally built in greed. So it's very subtle, but that distinction is really made, right? So I could say, and I'm not a Conrad scholar, that his sensitivities were, of course, very European, but one of the leading scholars in postcolonial studies, Edward Said, his first book was on Conrad, and that book was called The Fiction of Autobiography. And he clearly sees in Conrad's writing his Conrad's own experiential ambiguities, right, as an immigrant himself. And so that's why you can read passages in even in Heart of Darkness, which are deeply sympathetic to the natives and deeply critical of the kind of system the Europeans have built, especially in Congo. Can be learned from the attitudes towards colonialism, thinking practically, how does this help us prevent the control and exploitation of people? Very good question. So think of it this way. We could live our lives as we live them right now, uncritically, assuming that nothing bad is happening. America is the best of all the powers in the world, and no one is exploiting anyone. And a lot of people live their lives like that. And what that causes is that their political engagement in the world is just guided by self-interest, and they are not guided by any other impulse to make this world better or to point to historical and current injustices. When we read about, let's say, a book like Heart of Darkness, we read about history of colonialism and the atrocities that were committed in the name of civilization or whatever. What it teaches us, I think, is to read history more carefully, more critically, so that we know what was, how were people who came before us were implicated in the project of empire. And my hope is that by knowing that, by acknowledging that the world has this kind of a divide of powerful groups and less powerful groups, maybe then we start seeing our own lives more critically, and see, who is living kind of an oppressive life, who doesn't care about other people, right? And we can look at it through a gendered perspective, through an ethnic perspective, through a racial perspective, and see who is part of the dominant group. And if they are, how does their behavior impact those who are not? So I think all of these things we can learn from just a reading of Heart of Darkness. The question is, do we bring it to our own lives and look at our own actions and also our own responsibilities? So if we are critical of the world and assume that this world is an unjust place, right, in which certain people have more rights, certain people are exploited, then maybe we can, in terms of individual decisions, make better moral decisions. But maybe in terms of our politics, then we can align ourselves with groups who might be fighting to reduce injustice, who might be fighting to make the world or communities around us more egalitarian, safer for everyone. I think that's what we learn from the novel, but also from reading it with the lens of post-colonial theory. Now, other theories would do the same. If you're a feminist, right, if you're a gender theory person, if you're an African Americanist, this focus on the internal hierarchies of a system, the injustices written in it, enables us then to see those injustices. Because the first part is where people totally deny, right? And they'll tell you, oh, it's your problem, man. I can do this, why can't you do that? Not realizing that they might have a privileged racial position, they might have a privileged gender position, right? Do scholars in the modern day think his arguments are still somewhat valid? Oh, yes. Just like any field of study, literature has, there are people whose way of reading Conrad is very Eurocentric. So one way they will convince you is like, we don't care about the politics. We just want to look at the aesthetic aspects of the novel and see how beautifully a story is rendered, how is suspense produced, all those things that you do with any text, which you might have all learned in high school, where you are not supposed to think of any political thing, but just the technical aspects of the novel. Maybe sometimes some historical nugget in there. So scholars who are invested in just the form, right, or the language in a text will just basically say, this is what we do. It's not our job to point out whether Conrad was a racist or not, or whether this text is racist or not. So yes, there are still scholars who can read and do read Conrad and any other writers like that. But then there are scholars who go beyond that, right? Who look at the politics of a text, not just what's the politics in a text, right? But what kind of a politics does a text normalize, right? When you read it, what will you internalize as the normal way of looking at the world? And so these scholars then point to those things, right? For example, if you read a novel written in the early 20th century and you read it as a feminist or just simply as a woman, and you can then point out, look, this is a sexist novel. It represents women as second class citizens, it represents them as irrational, right? So, first of all, you're challenging what's in the novel itself. That's one way of doing it. The second would be you could say, hey, we are teaching this novel in our school system. And think what it is normalizing, right? Young women reading this novel would think that's their role, to be subservient, right? To be submissive. Is that what we want to teach our young women in schools? So now you're looking at it from the point of view of how a story can impact people's consciousness. All of this is coming from what a novel has within its pages, or what it can do if it is canonized and taught uncritically. Thank you so much for watching or listening to this brief clip. If you are interested in the longer version, the link will be in the description and you can watch the whole webinar. Thank you so much for your support. And as always, if you have any questions, any concerns, you can always post them in the comments and I'll be happy to respond to them. If you have a moment and if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, please do so now so that you get timely notifications of whatever is happening on this channel. Thank you for your support. Stay safe, and as always, from me to you, peace and love.